Welcome to the Subject Selection Expo for 2020 for subjects for 2021. The following presentation is on Year 11 History, 20th Century History. So our learning intentions today are to understand the subject Year 11 History, 20th Century History, and to understand the study design outcomes associated with Year 11 History. Unit 1 focuses on the period from 1918 to 1939. It's the period in between World War I and World War II, and it's where we had the change of politics, social, and cultural. In this particular period, we're looking at how new fascist governments used military, education, and propaganda to impose controls on the way people lived, to exclude particular groups of people, and to silence them. In Germany, the persecution of the Jewish people became intensified with the rise of the Nazi Party. In the USSR, millions of people were forced to work in state-owned factories and farms and had limited personal freedoms, while Japan became increasingly militarized and anti-Western. While in the USA, we had consumerism and material progress. Area of Study 1 is looking at the impacts of the treaties that concluded World War I have on the nations and peoples, and what were the dominant ideologies of the period. So we're looking at the rise of the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler and how the Treaty of Versailles helped to bring forth the social changes which led to the rise of the Nazi Party. Communist Russia emerged after 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. And in Japan, the government was increasingly influenced by the military and by anti-Western attitudes, shaping much of its political and social actions leading into World War II. So, on completion of this unit, you should be able to outline the features of a post-World War I, such as the peace treaties, the redrawing of borders, reparations and loss of territories. You should be able to outline the ideologies, the movements of fascism and Nazism. You've got to look at the established goals and limitations of the League of Nations, which come from Woodrow Wilson's 14 points response after World War One. And you should be able to look at significant influences and events which led to the World War II in 1939, such as the peace treaties, the League of Nations, and the rise of fascism and militarist regimes. Area of Study 2 looks at social and cultural change. So what continuity and change is evident between 1920s and 30s? How did ideologies affect the daily lives of people? How did cultural life both reflect the challenges of prevailing political, economic, and social circumstances? So we're looking at the emergence of societies driven by new ideologies, and in some countries, the consequences of oppression and persecution of certain groups of people. So you should be able to explain these patterns of social and cultural lives. You should be able to explain the role that race, class, and ethnicity, political affiliation, and gender play in the 1920s and 1930s. And you should be able to understand the extent to which certain groups of people were included or excluded from society, the ways in which particular forms of cultural expression such as art, literature, and architecture, film, and music influenced and reflected social and economic political change. Assessment as per VCAA is a historical inquiry, an analysis of primary sources, an analysis of historical interpretations, or an essay. Unit 2, we look at the period from 1945 to 2000. So we're looking at the period after World War II up until 2000. In particular, we're looking at the Cold War and the challenges and changes to existing political and economic and social arrangements. We're looking at the establishment of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Area of Study 1, we're looking at competing ideologies. So what caused the Cold War? The ideologies of communist USSR, so what Russia was, and the capitalism of the USA. And how did those two ideologies conflict and cause this Cold War to eventuate. So we investigate significant events and developments and the consequences for nations and peoples between 1945 and 1991. While the USA and the USSR never engaged in direct armed conflict, they opposed each other in a range of international conflicts, such as Korea and Vietnam. Now, these are considered proxy wars, where they never went to war with each other, the United States and the USSR, because of fear of MAD, which is the destruction from the nuclear weapons that they had. So you should be able to explain these ideological issues, the economic and political and social characteristics, the significance of the Cold War, the establishment and goals of the United Nations, to include initiatives to address areas of international concern about human rights. Area of Study 2, we look at challenge and change. We are looking at the significant causes of challenge to and change in existing political and social orders. How did the actions and ideas of popular movements and individuals contribute to change? So impedance movements led to the emergence of new nations. Some, like Algeria, achieved sovereignty through armed struggle. Others, including Papua New Guinea, through diplomatic means. While terrorism was not a new historical phenomenon, it took on a new dimensions and became increasingly globalized. So on completion of this unit, you should be able to understand how these independent movements emerged, and you should be able to look at the conditions and events that gave rise. You should be able to understand the ideas that influenced the challenge and brought about change, the methods employed by groups of people and individuals to implement change and express views, such as diplomacy, marches, civil disobedience, armed conflict, hijackings, and bombings. The responses of established political and social orders, both positive and negative. As per the VCA guidelines, the assessment will be historical inquiry, analysis of primary sources, and analysis of historical interpretations, and an essay. Undertaking this unit of history looks at a lot of the social and cultural changes that happened between World War I and II and after World War II. Now, this leads in nicely to the global politics unit for year 12, which talks about and goes into more detail about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the United Nations, and focuses on a more modern interpretation of history of what's happening around us now. So the Year 11 history unit is designed to give you an understanding of how we got to the position that we are in now.